It's wonderful to see you all again. I've got an extraordinary tale to tell you today.
Is that a knockoff? Gabriela Rodriguez sneered, flicking the collar of Maya's unbranded silk blouse before the entire dinner party. The table went silent. 6 pairs of eyes shifted from the shimmering gold centerpieces of the upscale restaurant to Maya Rodriguez. She sat at the far end, her posture perfectly straight, her hands resting calmly on a linen napkin. The fabric of her blouse was a heavy, double-faced mulberry silk that cost $400 a yard, but it bore no logo. To her sister, it looked like a bargain bin find. Gabriella, on the other hand, was a walking billboard. She wore a bright pink blazer with a designer monogram plastered over every square inch. A heavy gold chain clattered against her chest as she laughed, the sound sharp and metallic against the soft jazz playing in the background. Honestly, Maya, she continued, her voice dripping with mock pity, I know things are tight for you at that little tech startup, but you could at least try to look presentable for Dad's birthday. It's embarrassing. Roberto Rodriguez grunted in agreement from the head of the table. He adjusted his tie, another loud designer piece, and looked at his eldest daughter with profound disappointment. He had spent the last 20 minutes bragging about the new Lexus parked in the valet lot, a car he'd bought using dividends from the family investment account. Maya knew better. Those dividends were actually unauthorized withdrawals from the trust she had quietly funded 3 years ago to keep them afloat. I'm comfortable, Gabriella, Maya said, her voice a cool breeze against the heat of her sister's arrogance. Comfortable is what people say when they're broke, Carlos chimed in, leaning back and patting his stomach. As Gabriella's husband, he had made a career out of spending money he hadn't earned. He checked his watch, a flashy, oversized chronograph that was likely gold-plated rather than solid. Roberto, we talked about this. Maya's clearly struggling to manage her meager salary. It's time we implemented the allowance system we discussed. Maya felt a familiar tightening in her chest, but she didn't let it reach her face. She reached for her water glass, the cold condensation chilling her fingertips. Beneath the cuff of her left sleeve, the weight of her Patek Philippe was a secret anchor. It was a grand complications, a masterpiece of horology that cost more than the Lexus Roberto was so proud of. She didn't wear it for status. She wore it because she appreciated the precision. An allowance, Maya asked softly. It's for your own good, Roberto Rodriguez barked, his voice echoing across the crowded room. 2 women at a nearby table turned to stare. He didn't care. He loved an audience. You're 30 years old and still dressing like a librarian. You obviously don't understand the value of $1. From now on, your paychecks from that startup will be deposited into the family account. I'll distribute a monthly stipend to you for your rent and groceries. You want me to hand over my entire income? She asked. It's a family contribution, Gabriella said, reaching for her wine glass. The smell of her cloying, expensive perfume filled the air between them. Since you're clearly not using the money to improve your station, we might as well use it to maintain the family image. Miguel and Sofia agree, don't you? Miguel Rodriguez, the youngest brother, looked down at his plate, shifting his peas with a fork. He was the only one who looked even slightly uncomfortable, but he didn't speak up. He just nodded once, his eyes fixed on the tablecloth. Sofia, his girlfriend, was too busy taking a selfie with her cocktail to notice the tension. I see, Maya said. She felt the vibration of her phone in her clutch. It was a priority alert. Her company, the one they called a little startup, had just finalized a proprietary acquisition. Her net worth had just increased by $40 million in a single afternoon. The irony tasted like iron in her mouth. She looked at her father, seeing the lines of greed etched around his eyes. He didn't see a daughter, he saw a resource. He saw the sleeping lion and thought she was a house cat. Give me the login to your banking app, Roberto demanded, reaching across the table. We'll set up the transfer now. No sense in waiting. Maya didn't move. She thought about the Lexus outside. She thought about the $5,000 designer bag Gabriella had perched on the empty chair beside her, a bag bought with money stolen from Maya's poverty. I'm afraid I can't do that tonight, Dad, she said. The table erupted. Gabriella gasped as if she'd been slapped. Roberto's face turned a dangerous shade of purple, his hand slamming onto the table so hard the silverware jumped. "You ungrateful girl," he hissed. "After everything I've given you, I gave you the education that allowed you to get that job. You owe me everything." Maya stood up slowly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The calm she projected was far more terrifying than his rage. She reached into her purse and pulled out a single, crisp $100 bill, placing it on the table to cover her portion of the meal. "I have a meeting tomorrow morning," she said, her eyes locking onto her father's, "with Mrs. Coleman at the private wealth branch. There's been some unusual activity in the family accounts. I'm sure you'd want me to get to the bottom of it." The color drained from Roberto's face so quickly it was almost comical. He knew Mrs. Coleman. She was the only person who knew the true source of the Rodriguez family's sudden wealth. "Maya, wait," Roberto stammered, his voice losing its bark. "Good night, everyone," she said, turning away. As she walked toward the exit, she could hear Gabriella starting to screech about her disrespect, but Maya didn't hear the words. She was already thinking about the audit. She was thinking about the locks she would change and the accounts she would freeze. She stepped out into the cool night air, the valet rushing forward. He didn't head for the Lexus. He headed for the black, unbranded sedan parked in the shadows, a car with a custom engine and armored glass that cost more than the rest of the cars in the lot combined. Maya climbed into the back seat and pulled out her phone. She had one new message from Mrs. Coleman. "The evidence is ready. Just say the word." Maya watched her family through the restaurant window, seeing them argue over the bills she had already covered. She felt the heavy tick of the Patek Philippe against her wrist. "Wait for it," she whispered to the empty car. The countdown had begun. Within 48 hours, the new money would be gone, and the Rodriguez family would finally learn exactly who had been feeding them. The scent of expensive Cuban tobacco clung to the heavy velvet curtains of the study, a room Maya Rodriguez had paid to renovate but was now treated as a guest in. Roberto Rodriguez sat behind the mahogany desk, his fingers tracing the gold leaf trim of a lighter. He didn't look up when she entered. He simply let a thick cloud of smoke drift toward the ceiling, his silence a practiced tool of intimidation. "The dinner last night was a disgrace," he finally said, his voice a low rumble of disappointment. "Your sister had to drive home in a car that costs more than your annual salary, Maya, and you couldn't even manage a smile for the family photos. You looked like a servant who'd lost her way to the kitchen." Maya stood near the door, her posture perfectly still. Beneath the sleeve of her charcoal gray silk blouse, a fabric so fine it felt like a second skin, the Patek Philippe hummed with a precision her father would never understand. "I paid the bill, Roberto. I thought that was the contribution you valued most." He slammed the lighter onto the desk. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Don't use that tone with me. You provide because it is your duty. You are the eldest, yet you live like a hermit while Gabriella and Miguel are out building the family's reputation. Carlos tells me you're still consulting for those little tech startups. It's embarrassing." He reached into a drawer and slid a legal document across the desk. "Sign this. It's a formalization of the family trust. It ensures that a fixed percentage of your earnings is diverted directly to the household account. No more waiting for you to decide when to be generous." The audacity of the demand felt like a physical weight in the room. He wasn't just stealing anymore. He was trying to colonize her future. Maya walked forward, her footsteps silent on the hand-woven rug. She didn't pick up the pen. Instead, she touched the edge of the paper, feeling the grain of the expensive cardstock they'd bought with her diverted dividends. "The silver anniversary gala is in 48 hours, she said, her voice devoid of the anger he expected. "Is that why you need the formalization now? To pay for the catering?" Roberto sneered, leaning back in his leather chair. "It's to ensure we never have to worry about your whims again. Now sign it and go change. Gabriella is outside with her new trophy. Try to look happy for her for once." Maya turned and walked out, the document left unsigned on the desk. As she stepped onto the wide, sun-drenched driveway, The roar of a high-performance engine tore through the afternoon quiet. A gleaming white Lexus swung around the fountain, tires screeching against the gravel before jerking to a halt. Gabriela Rodriguez hopped out of the driver's seat, her designer heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She looked like a walking billboard for every logo-heavy brand in existence. Behind her, Miguel Rodriguez and Carlos followed, laughing as they admired the car's aggressive lines. "Isn't she beautiful?" Gabriela squealed, not even glancing at Maya as she ran a hand over the hood. "The interior is custom cream leather. Carlos said I deserved the best, and honestly, he was right. It's much better than that dented sedan you're always hiding in, Maya." "It's a lot of car," Maya remarked, her eyes tracing the VIN number visible through the windshield. She already knew the registration was tied to a shell company her father had set up using her social security number. "I hope the insurance is settled." Carlos stepped forward, his smile oily and triumphant. "Don't worry about the logistics, Maya. Some of us are built for the fast lane, and some are built to provide the fuel. Why don't you go inside and help Mrs. Coleman with the seating charts for the gala? It's more your speed." Miguel chuckled, leaning against the Lexus. "Careful, Carlos. If she gets too upset, she might stop paying for the premium gas." Maya felt the familiar sting of their collective contempt, but this time it was tempered by a cold, sharpening clarity. She reached into her pocket and felt the small, encrypted drive Mrs. Coleman had delivered. It contained every unauthorized transfer, every forged signature Roberto had used to fund this lifestyle. She walked past them toward the gardens, pulling her phone from her pocket. She dialed a number she hadn't called in years, her lead counsel at the firm that handled her tech conglomerate's acquisitions. "It's Maya," she said when the line picked up. "The audit is complete. I want the freeze triggered at exactly 8:00 p.m. on the night of the gala, not a second earlier. I want them to feel the floor vanish while they're standing on it." She hung up and looked back at the white Lexus, the sun glinting off its polished surface. They were so busy celebrating their stolen status that they hadn't noticed the shadow falling over them. 2 days. In 48 hours, the gala wouldn't be a celebration of the Rodriguez legacy. It would be an estate sale. Maya checked her watch. The countdown was no longer in days. It was in heartbeats. Maya Rodriguez sat in the hushed, mahogany-lined office of her lead counsel, the silence broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a vintage clock. The air smelled of old parchment and expensive floor wax, a stark contrast to the chaotic, perfume-choked atmosphere of her father's house. She watched as the attorney reviewed the documents Mrs. Coleman had prepared. The audit was a masterpiece of forensic accounting, a digital trail of breadcrumbs leading directly to her father's greed. "It's all here, Maya," the lawyer whispered, sliding a leather-bound folder across the desk. "The unauthorized transfers, the forged signatures on the corporate shell accounts, and the diverted dividends. Roberto Rodriguez hasn't just been skimming, he's been hemorrhaging your capital to maintain a facade of wealth that doesn't exist." Maya felt the cool, unbranded silk of her sleeve brush against her wrist as she reached for the folder. Beneath the fabric, the $100,000 Patek Philippe hummed with silent precision, a secret weight that grounded her. She didn't need the flash of Gabriela's stolen diamonds to know her own worth. She was the architect of this empire, and she was about to become its wrecking ball. The family meeting took place 3 hours later at a restaurant so exclusive it didn't bother with a sign. Roberto Rodriguez sat at the head of the circular table like a king presiding over a crumbling court. He smelled of heavy tobacco and cloying, expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask the scent of desperation. Gabriela was to his right, her fingers adorned with rings Maya recognized from the family's emergency vault, pieces that should have been sold to pay the staff, not flaunted over lobster thermidor. "You're late," Roberto snapped as Maya took her seat. He didn't look up from his wine. "But then, I suppose we can't expect punctuality from someone who spends her days playing with computers while her family handles the real business of the Rodriguez legacy." "I was finishing some paperwork," she said, her voice a calm, steady anchor in the sea of his arrogance. Gabriella let out a sharp, mocking laugh, the sound of glass grinding on stone. She adjusted her designer scarf, making sure the logo was visible to the entire room. Paperwork? Is that what you call it? Honestly, Maya, look at you. You're wearing that same gray blouse again. People are starting to whisper. They think the Rodriguez family has a charity case for a daughter. It's embarrassing. Maya took a slow sip of water, the cold condensation biting into her palm. She watched Gabriella's husband, Carlos, lean forward. He had the hungry look of a man who had spent his life looking for a shortcut. "That's actually why we called this meeting," Carlos said, his voice dripping with feigned concern. "We've been looking at the family's liquidity. With the gala coming up, we need to ensure our image is impeccable. Roberto and I have discussed it, and we think it's best if your accounts are consolidated, under your father's oversight, of course." The audacity of the statement hung in the air like a physical weight. Maya looked at Miguel Rodriguez, who sat across from her, eyes averted. He knew what they were doing, but the lure of the lifestyle was too strong for him to speak. "Consolidated?" Maya asked softly. "An allowance system," Roberto clarified, finally meeting her gaze with a look of cold entitlement. "You clearly don't understand the value of the money you earn. You live like a pauper while the family name suffers. From now on, your salary will be deposited into the central estate account. I will distribute funds to you based on your needs. It's for your own protection." The rage spiked in Maya's chest, a hot, sharp needle. They weren't just stealing from her anymore. They were trying to put a leash on her. They wanted to turn the founder of a multi-billion-dollar tech conglomerate into a child receiving a weekly stipend from the very man who was bankrupting her. "You want to manage my money," she said, her tone devoid of emotion. "It's for the best, Maya," Gabriella added, checking her reflection in a silver spoon. "Maybe then you'll finally buy a dress that doesn't look like it came from a clearance rack. We have a reputation to uphold. The Lexus out front, that's the standard, not whatever it is you do." Maya felt the folder in her bag, the blueprint for their destruction. She could have ended it right there. She could have thrown the audit on the table and watched the color drain from their faces. But that would be too quick. They needed to be at their highest point before the fall. They needed the lights of the gala, the eyes of the elite, and the crushing weight of public shame. "I see," Maya said, her voice dropping to a whisper that forced them to lean in. "If that's what the family requires, I won't stand in the way. I'll ensure the primary accounts are ready for the transition on the night of the gala." Roberto smirked, a look of triumph crossing his weathered face. He signaled the waiter for another bottle of the most expensive vintage on the menu. "A wise choice. It's good to see you finally understanding your place, Maya. We are the Rodriguez family. We don't ask for what we want, we take it." Carlos raised his glass in a mock toast. "To the legacy." Maya raised her water glass, her eyes locking onto her father's. The dramatic irony was a sweet, cold fire in her veins. They thought they had just secured their future. They didn't realize they had just signed their eviction notices. "To the legacy," she repeated, "and to everything it's about to become." As she walked out of the restaurant, the valet hurried to open the door for a group of socialites, ignoring Maya in her simple attire. She didn't mind. She stepped into the shadows of the parking lot, pulling her phone from her pocket. She checked the countdown timer she had set, 36 hours. She watched the white Lexus pull out of the lot, Roberto behind the wheel, driving a car bought with her sweat, heading toward a house she technically owned, to prepare for a gala she was currently funding. They were living in a house of cards, and she was the wind. Maya Rodriguez didn't head home. She drove back to the office, the silent city lights reflecting in her eyes. There was one more piece of the blueprint to finalize. She needed to ensure that when the freeze hit at 8:00 p.m., there wasn't a single cent left in their reach, not even for the valet. She sat at her desk, the blue light of the monitor illuminating her face. She began the final sequence of the transfer. The countdown wasn't just in her head anymore. It was on the screen, a digital heartbeat skipping toward 0. "Enjoy the lobster, Roberto," she whispered to the empty room. "It's the last thing I'm ever buying you." The scent of expensive cedar and steam-pressed wool filled the air of the boutique, a sharp contrast to the stale coffee and hum of servers Maya Rodriguez had left behind at the office. She stood in the corner of the private fitting room, her arms crossed, watching the tailor pin the hem of her father's midnight blue tuxedo. Roberto Rodriguez caught her eye in the three-way mirror and adjusted his silk tie, his chest swelling with a pride he hadn't earned. "The lapels need to be sharper," he barked at the tailor, who was kneeling on the floor. "This is a night for the history books. I won't have the Rodriguez name looking like it bought off the rack." Maya felt the cold, heavy weight of the Patek Philippe hidden beneath her modest cotton sleeve. It was a silent ticking reminder of the wealth she actually controlled, and the poverty her father was about to inherit. She checked her phone. 24 hours remained. "The guest list for the after-party at the penthouse has doubled," Roberto said, turning away from his reflection to face her. "I need you to authorize another $50,000 for the premium bar and the late-night catering." "Gabriella wants a champagne tower." Maya didn't blink. "The accounts are stretched thin, Dad. Maybe we should stick to the original budget. Markets are volatile right now. Sometimes what looks like a mountain of gold is just a shadow." Roberto let out a sharp, dismissive laugh that echoed against the mahogany walls. "Markets? What do you know about markets? You sit in a cubicle and move numbers I give you. The well only runs dry if the workhorse stops pulling the plow, Maya, and you're a very reliable horse." Beside him, Carlos leaned against a display of Italian leather shoes, a predatory smirk playing on his lips. He adjusted the cuffs of a jacket he hadn't paid for. "She's right about one thing, Roberto. We should be careful. That's why I was thinking we should move the remaining liquid assets into that management trust we discussed. It'll protect Maya from making any emotional mistakes with the family fortune." The allowance system. They were already planning to lock her out of her own earnings before the first champagne cork even popped at the gala. Maya felt the familiar sting of rage, but she channeled it into a calm, icy mask. She looked at Carlos, then back at her father. "I'm giving you a fair warning," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet cutting through the hiss of a nearby steam iron. "The financial climate is changing. If you overextend yourself today, there won't be a safety net tomorrow." "Are you sure you want to authorize these extra charges?" Roberto waved his hand as if swatting away a fly. "Authorized, signed, delivered. Just do your job and make the transfer. I have a legacy to build. Miguel Rodriguez is already at the venue overseeing the floral arrangements. Everything must be perfect." Miguel, her brother, the one who had stayed silent while they discussed her allowance. He was just as complicit, waiting for his slice of the stolen pie. A small chime echoed from Maya's purse. She pulled out her phone and saw a message from Mrs. Coleman. "The freeze is scheduled for 8:00 p.m. tomorrow. All secondary access points have been redirected. The ghost protocol is active." "Is that the bank?" Carlos asked, stepping closer, his eyes narrowing as he tried to catch a glimpse of her screen. Maya slid the phone back into her bag. "Just a notification. The transfer for the champagne tower is being processed." "Good," Roberto said, turning back to the mirror. "And make sure you wear something decent tomorrow, not that gray rag you've been sporting. People will think I don't provide for my daughter." The tailor paused, his shears hovering over the expensive fabric. He looked at Maya, then at the arrogant man standing on the pedestal. He had seen thousands of wealthy men in this room, but there was something about the way Maya stood, the stillness of her posture, the lack of desperation in her eyes, that made him hesitate. He noticed the way she didn't flinch at the insults, as if she were a queen listening to the ramblings of a court jester. "I'll find something appropriate to wear," Maya said. "I promise by this time tomorrow, everyone will see exactly who I am." She turned and walked toward the door, the sound of her flat shoes silent on the plush carpet. Behind her, she heard Carlos and Roberto laughing, already spending the money that no longer existed in their names. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, the city lights felt like a countdown. She drove home in silence, the steering wheel of her modest sedan firm in her grip. Tonight was the final night of the old world. Tomorrow, the house of cards would meet the wind. She reached into her glove box and pulled out the invitation to the gala, the one her family thought was her ticket to a lifetime of servitude. She tore it in half. She didn't need an invitation to a house she already owned. Back at her apartment, she sat in the dark, watching the digital clock on her microwave blink. 12:01 a.m. The day of the gala had arrived. Her phone buzzed one last time. It was a photo from Gabriella showing off a diamond necklace with the caption, "Found my sparkle for tonight. Thanks for the bonus, sis." Maya deleted the message without replying. She closed her eyes, visualizing the look on Roberto's face when the first credit card was declined in front of 500 people. The warning had been given. The arrogance had been documented. Now there was only the wait. The St. Regis ballroom was a cavern of gold leaf and crystal, the air thick with the cloyingly sweet scent of white lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of expensive champagne. Roberto Rodriguez stood at the center of a circle of local developers, his chest puffed out like a prize rooster. He wore a tuxedo that shouted its price tag, a silk lapel so shiny it looked wet under the heavy glare of the chandeliers. Beside him, Gabriela Rodriguez was a whirlwind of sequins and artificial laughter, her hand constantly flying to the diamond necklace that sat like a sparkling collar around her throat. She moved with the frantic energy of someone who had finally stepped into the light and was terrified the sun might set. Maya Rodriguez stepped into the room, her presence as quiet as a shadow. She had chosen a charcoal silk dress, tailored to perfection by a woman in Milan who didn't use labels, only signature stitching. To the untrained eye of her family, she looked like an assistant who had wandered into the wrong party. To the experts in the room, the drape of the fabric whispered of a 4-figure price tag per yard. She felt the cool, reassuring weight of the Patek Philippe against her wrist, hidden beneath the long, elegant sleeve of her gown. It was 7:15 p.m. In 45 minutes, the world her father had built on a foundation of her stolen labor would begin to tilt. Carlos approached her first, a predatory glint in his eyes that he mistook for business acumen. He didn't offer a greeting. Instead, he signaled a waiter to bring a tray of hors d'oeuvres, picking one up and inspecting the caviar with a look of bored disdain before turning his gaze to her. "You're late, Maya," he said, his voice carrying just far enough for the nearby investors to turn their heads. "But I suppose we can't expect punctuality from someone who doesn't have a real schedule to keep." He leaned in closer, the smell of expensive scotch and peppermint wafting off him. "Roberto and I had a talk this morning. We've decided on a new structure for your monthly allowance. Given your lack of contribution to the family's recent expansion, we're cutting the stipend by 60%. We'll be managing your utilities and rent directly from the firm's account from now on. It's for your own good, really. You've become far too comfortable on our dime, and it's stifling your motivation." Maya didn't flinch. She took a slow sip of her mineral water, the cold condensation on the glass a grounding force against her palm. She watched him, noting the way he adjusted his tie with the casual confidence of a man who had never been told no. "You've put a lot of thought into this, Carlos," she said, her voice a calm, low melody that contrasted sharply with his jagged tone. "It's about accountability," he replied, his smirk widening. "Something you're going to learn a lot about tonight. We're tired of carrying the weight for someone who just sits in a home office all day playing with code, while we do the heavy lifting in the real world." She moved away from him without a word, her gaze sweeping the room. She spotted Mrs. Coleman near the bar, dressed in a sharp, professional navy suit. The bank manager offered a single, imperceptible nod before returning to her conversation with a city councilman. The trap was set. The accounts had been drained, the transfers to Maya's private offshore holdings finalized at the stroke of 5. Every credit line Roberto intended to flaunt tonight was currently a hollow shell, a digital ghost of wealth that no longer existed. Miguel Rodriguez joined them a moment later, looking significantly more anxious than the others. He kept checking his phone, his eyes darting toward the entrance every time the heavy oak doors swung open. He knew the legal papers Maya had shown him were real, but the lure of the family's new money was a powerful drug, and he was clearly struggling with the withdrawal symptoms of a guilty conscience. "Dad's about to make the announcement," he whispered, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for a drink from a passing tray. He avoided Maya's eyes, pulling her toward the raised dais at the front of the room where the microphone stood waiting. Gabriella caught up with them, her heels clicking aggressively on the marble floor. She reached out and flicked a stray, invisible piece of lint from Maya's shoulder, her expression one of exaggerated, honeyed pity. "Don't look so glum, sis. You're bringing down the vibe of the VIP section," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Listen, I know the allowance cut is going to be hard for you. Maybe if you're a good girl tonight and don't make any scenes, I'll let you borrow the Lexus for a weekend. It's the least I can do since you're basically a charity case now. Just try to stay in the background when the photographers come around, okay? That dress is a bit librarian for the front page." Maya smiled. It wasn't the broken, submissive smile they expected. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey walk into a cage and lock the door from the inside. "I think tonight will be full of surprises for everyone, Gabriella. You should enjoy the necklace while you can. It really catches the light." Roberto stepped onto the dais, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal flute. The sound rang through the ballroom like a death knell, sharp and final. The room fell silent, 500 of the city's elite turning their attention to the man who claimed to be the architect of a new technological empire. He looked down at the crowd, his eyes resting on Maya with a cruel, triumphant fire. He thought he was about to deliver the final blow to her independence, to show the world who held the purse strings. "Friends, colleagues, and honored guests," Roberto began, his voice booming with unearned authority. "Tonight is not just a celebration of our family's success, but the beginning of a multi-million-dollar venture that will redefine the tech landscape in this city. We have built this from the ground up, through sweat, sacrifice, and the vision of a true Rodriguez." He paused for dramatic effect, gesturing toward Carlos and Gabriella, who stood beaming at his side. He pointedly ignored Maya, who stood a few feet back, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "To prove our commitment to this new era," Roberto continued, his grin widening into something predatory, "I am personally authorizing a $10 million opening deposit into our new investment fund, right here, right now, in front of all of you. We believe in transparency, and we believe in the power of our capital." He looked at Carlos, who held a tablet ready to execute the public transfer that would be mirrored on the giant LED screens flanking the stage. The crowd leaned in, phones rising to record the moment of performative wealth. Maya reached into her clutch and felt the smooth, cold surface of her own phone. A single notification was waiting on the screen, all external access protocols terminated. Master account secured. She looked up at her father and nodded, a silent, icy invitation to proceed. "Carlos," Roberto barked, his voice thick with the intoxication of his own ego. "Show them the Rodriguez power. Execute the transfer." Carlos tapped the screen with a flourish, his finger hovering over the button for a fraction of a second to savor the tension. The large monitors hummed to life, the Rodriguez family logo fading away to reveal the banking portal. Maya took a slow breath, the scent of the lilies suddenly overwhelmed by the electric charge of the coming storm. She watched her father's face, waiting for the exact second the red text would appear. "Do it," Roberto urged, his eyes locked on the investors in the front row. Carlos pressed the screen. The room held its breath. On the giant monitors, the loading icon spun once, twice, and then the screen turned a jarring, brilliant crimson. In bold, white letters that everyone in the ballroom could read, the system delivered its verdict. Transaction DENIED. Insufficient funds. Account closed. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt physical. Roberto's smile didn't vanish. It froze, turning into a grotesque mask of confusion as he stared at the screen. Carlos tapped the tablet frantically, his face turning a shade of purple that matched his silk tie. Maya stood perfectly still, the only person in the room who wasn't breathing like they'd just run a marathon. She met her father's eyes, and for the first time in her life, she saw the flicker of genuine, soul-deep terror behind his arrogance. "Is there a problem, father?" Maya asked, her voice cutting through the silence like a razor through silk. Maya Rodriguez didn't wait for an answer. The silence in the ballroom was so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving her father gasping in the vacuum. Roberto Rodriguez stared at the crimson, denied message on the monitors, his hand still frozen in midair as if he could reach out and pluck the stolen millions back from the digital ether. "The system is glitched," Carlos barked, his voice cracking as he stepped toward the tech technicians at the side of the stage. He adjusted his designer blazer, but the movement was jerky, lacking his usual predatory grace. "Refresh it. That account has a $20 million liquidity floor. Do your jobs." "It isn't a glitch, Carlos," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried to the back of the hall. She felt the cool weight of her Patek Philippe against her wrist, a silent reminder of the world she truly inhabited, the one they had spent years trying to bleed dry. Mrs. Coleman stepped out from the shadows of the velvet curtains, clutching a leather-bound folder. She didn't look like a bank manager. She looked like an executioner. With a sharp nod to the AV booth, the screen changed. The insufficient funds alert vanished, replaced by a high-resolution scan of a corporate merger agreement dated 3 weeks ago. Roberto Rodriguez's face underwent a violent transformation, the skin turning a mottled, bruised purple before draining into a sickly, translucent gray. His eyes, usually sharp with predatory arrogance, became glassy and unfocused, darting toward the screen as if the words might change if he blinked fast enough. His lower lip developed a rhythmic, uncontrollable tremor that made his expensive dental veneers click against one another, a frantic sound in the cavernous silence. Sweat began to bead along his hairline, carving tracks through his foundation and dripping onto his silk tie, while his jaw hung slack, his throat working in dry, silent heaves that looked like a fish gasping for oxygen on a hot deck. He looked less like a patriarch and more like a man watching his own ghost leave his body. "What is this?" Gabriela Rodriguez shrieked, her voice echoing off the marble pillars. She gripped the pearls at her neck so hard the strings snapped, the white beads clattering across the floor like tiny teeth. "Maya, what did you do to our money?" "It was never your money, Gabriela," Maya said, turning to look at her sister. The smell of Gabriela's cloying, $500 an ounce perfume suddenly felt suffocating. "It was the company's capital. Capital you and Carlos spent on a Lexus and a villa in Spain while I was sleeping in a studio apartment to keep the servers running." Miguel Rodriguez stepped back, his face pale as he looked at the legal seal on the screen. He was the first to see the fine print. "The Rodriguez Group. It's been absorbed by an anonymous holding firm." "Not anonymous," Mrs. Coleman corrected, her voice crisp. She opened the folder and began to read. "As of midnight, the Rodriguez Group was acquired in a hostile takeover by Apex Horizon. The primary shareholder of Apex Horizon is Maya Rodriguez." The room erupted in a low, frantic hum of whispers. The socialites who had spent the evening mocking Maya's unbranded dress and lack of jewelry suddenly shifted. Mrs. Gable, who had laughed at Maya's poor shoes earlier, took a literal step back, her champagne glass trembling. The board members, men who had ignored Maya for a decade, were now staring at her with a mixture of terror and sudden, oily respect. Carlos lunged forward, his face contorted. "You can't do that. That's family property. We'll sue you for every cent." "With what?" Maya asked, her calm cutting through his rage like a scalpel. "The accounts are drained because the company you were managing was insolvent. I didn't steal the money, Carlos. I bought the debt, and then I foreclosed on it." She walked toward her father. Roberto was leaning against the podium, his knuckles white as he gripped the wood. He looked at her, and for the first time, Maya didn't see a giant. She saw a small, frightened man who had built a throne out of other people's sacrifices. "You said I didn't belong at this table, father," Maya said, the words tasting like cold, clean water. "You said my only value was the allowance you graciously permitted me to earn, but you forgot one thing." She leaned in, her voice for him alone, though the silence was so deep the front row heard every syllable. "I didn't just build the software. I built the walls, and I just locked the doors." Maya turned her back on him before he could find his breath. She didn't look at Gabriella's tears or Miguel's panicked phone calls to his lawyers. She walked toward the grand mahogany doors of the ballroom, the sound of her modest heels striking the marble with the rhythm of a closing gavel. "Maya!" Roberto's voice was a ragged, desperate wheeze. "Where are you going? We need to talk about the transition." Maya paused at the exit, silhouetted against the bright lights of the foyer. She didn't turn around. "There is no transition, Roberto," she said. "The locks on the house and the office are being changed as we speak. You have 30 minutes to finish your drinks." She stepped out into the night, the heavy doors swinging shut behind her, leaving the Rodriguez family to the $847 million silence of their own making. Outside, the air was crisp, smelling of rain and possibilities. She pulled out her phone and saw a single message from Mrs. Coleman. "The police are arriving at the back entrance for Carlos. The fraud warrants are live." Maya smiled, a small, tired thing, and signaled for a car. The game wasn't just over. The board had been burned to ash. But as her car pulled away, she saw a black sedan pull into the driveway, its lights off. Someone was waiting. The heavy glass doors of the private wealth wing at the city's most exclusive bank didn't just open. They practically buckled under the weight of Roberto Rodriguez's fury. He marched across the polished marble floor, his designer loafers clicking with a frantic, uneven rhythm that betrayed his panic. Behind him, Gabriela Rodriguez struggled to keep up, her face a mask of tear-streaked foundation and indignant rage. She clutched a designer handbag like a shield, her knuckles white against the expensive leather. "I want her fired," Roberto bellowed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings and drawing the startled gazes of 3 high-net-worth clients near the mahogany desks. "I want that woman in handcuffs for what she did to my accounts last night." Mrs. Coleman stepped out from behind the security partition, her expression as cool and unyielding as the granite counters. She didn't flinch at the patriarch's shouting. Instead, she adjusted her glasses and gestured toward the soundproofed conference room at the end of the hall. "Mr. Rodriguez, if you could please lower your voice. We have been expecting you." "You're damn right you've been expecting me," Roberto snapped, shoving past her. Miguel Rodriguez followed a few paces behind, looking smaller than usual, his eyes darting toward the security guards stationed at every exit. He looked like a man who had finally realized the ground beneath him had turned to quicksand. They burst into the conference room, Gabriela already launching into a tirade. "My car was towed this morning. The Lexus is gone. Do you have any idea how humiliating it is to have the neighbors watch a repo man?" She stopped mid-sentence. Her mouth hung open, the words dying in a throat tightened by sudden, icy fear. Maya Rodriguez sat at the head of the long obsidian table. She didn't look like the daughter they had spent years belittling. She wore a simple, charcoal gray blazer made of wool so fine it shimmered under the recessed lighting. She didn't have a single logo on her person, but the Patek Philippe on her wrist caught the light, a silent, 6-figure testament to a world her family had only ever glimpsed from the outside. "Sit down, Roberto," Maya said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried the absolute authority of someone who held every card in the deck. "You ungrateful little brat," Roberto hissed, though he took the seat, his hands shaking as he gripped the edge of the table. "You think changing a few passwords makes you the boss? I'm your father. That money is family money. It belongs to the Rodriguez name, and I will have you in a cell for theft by the end of the business day." "The only person going to a cell today is Carlos," Maya replied calmly. She slid a thick, blue-bound folder across the table. "And perhaps you, if you don't listen very carefully to what the men behind me have to say." For the first time, the family noticed the 2 men in dark, understated suits standing in the shadows of the room's far corner. One of them stepped forward, placing a badge on the table. "Special Agent Vance, Federal Financial Crimes Division." The silence that followed was visceral. It was the sound of a vacuum, sucking the oxygen out of the room until Gabriela began to wheeze. We've spent the last 6 hours reviewing the allowance system you established, Roberto, Maya said, her eyes locked on her father's. Specifically, the way you used my social security number to open offshore shells to hide the funds you were siphoning from my tech firm's dividends. You didn't just steal from me. You committed federal tax evasion and wire fraud on a scale that will keep you in a jumpsuit for the rest of your natural life. Roberto Rodriguez's face didn't just fall, it seemed to dissolve. The deep, arrogant lines of his forehead smoothed out into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. His skin transitioned from a flush of indignant red to a sickly, translucent gray in seconds, the color of wet ash. His heavy jowls, usually set in a firm scowl of authority, began to tremble uncontrollably, a rhythmic twitch that made his thin lips flutter. His eyes, once sharp with the expectation of obedience, bulged behind his glasses, darting toward the federal agents as if looking for a hole in the floor to swallow him whole. He looked less like a patriarch and more like a landed fish, gasping for air that had suddenly turned to poison. "Maya," Miguel whispered, his voice cracking. "I didn't know about the shells. I just wanted a piece of what was ours." "It was never yours, Miguel," she said, her gaze shifting to her brother. "You watched them treat me like a servant in my own house while you spent my hard work on watches and club tables. You're a witness, not a defendant for now. That depends on how much you tell the agents in the next hour." Gabriella let out a sharp, hysterical sob. "You can't do this. We're family. I have a reputation. Sophia is starting private school next month." "The tuition check bounced this morning, Gabriella," Maya said, her voice devoid of pity. "Along with the mortgage on the house you thought Roberto bought for you. It turns out, when you build a life on stolen foundations, it only takes one person to pull the thread." Mrs. Coleman stepped forward, placing a single document in front of Roberto. "This is a full confession and an agreement to liquidate all assets currently held in the Rodriguez Family Trust to settle the back taxes and restitution. If you sign it, the U.S. attorney might consider a plea. If you don't, the agents have the warrants ready for execution right now." Roberto looked at the pen as if it were a venomous snake. He looked at Maya, searching for the girl he used to silence with a single glare. He found only a stranger, a woman who had outgrown his shadow years ago and was now letting the sun burn him. "You said I was the help, Dad," Maya said, standing up and smoothing her blazer. "You were right. I've spent the last decade helping you build a prison of your own making. I'm just here to close the door." She didn't wait for him to pick up the pen. She didn't stay to watch Gabriella's inevitable breakdown or Miguel's desperate attempt to cut a deal. Maya walked toward the exit, the sound of her heels steady and purposeful. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back at the broken remains of the Rodriguez legacy. "Mrs. Coleman will handle the rest. I have a board meeting for a company you'll never even be allowed to visit." Maya stepped out into the bright, crisp morning air. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a notification from her security team. The black sedan that had been following her was gone, replaced by a permanent detail of her own choosing. She signaled for her car, but as she stepped toward the curb, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows of the bank's columns. It was a man she hadn't seen in years, the one person who knew exactly where the rest of the money was hidden. "You did it," the man said, his voice low and raspy. "But you forgot one thing, Maya. Roberto wasn't the one who started the shells. I was." 6 months had passed since the morning the Rodriguez name was stripped from the marble lobby of the downtown tower. In the quiet, rarefied air of the 44th floor, Maya Rodriguez sat behind a desk of reclaimed obsidian, the surface so dark it seemed to swallow the morning light. She adjusted the cuff of her unbranded gray cashmere sweater, the fabric soft against her skin, momentarily revealing the $100K Patek Philippe that hummed with silent, mechanical precision. Outside, the city was a grid of ambition and failure, but up here, the only sound was the faint hiss of the climate control and the rhythmic scratching of a titanium fountain pen. She was no longer a ghost in her own company. She was the architect of its rebirth. A soft chime announced a visitor. Mrs. Coleman stepped into the office, her sharp eyes scanning the room with the professional approval of a woman who had seen empires rise and fall. She didn't carry the heavy leather ledgers of the bank anymore. Instead, she held a single, slim tablet. "The final liquidation is complete," she said, her voice echoing slightly against the floor-to-ceiling glass. "The estate in the Hamptons sold this morning." After the back taxes and the legal fees from the fraud discovery, there was exactly $14 left in the primary account. "I've had it transferred to a charitable trust for displaced workers." Maya nodded, her expression unreadable. "And the family." Mrs. Coleman hesitated, a flicker of something like pity crossing her face before it was replaced by her usual steel. "Roberto Rodriguez is currently residing in a rent-controlled 2-bedroom in a part of Queens he used to call the gutter. I'm told he spends most of his days at the local library, using the free internet to draft letters to the board of directors that no one reads. He still insists the shell companies were a legitimate tax strategy." Maya felt a familiar spark of heat in her chest, a lingering rage spike. Even now, after losing the cars, the prestige, and the very roof over his head, her father refused to acknowledge the theft. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own making, still trying to command the waves. "He called the office yesterday," Maya said, her voice cool. "He wanted to know if I'd be a good daughter and pay for his club membership. He said it was important for the family image." Mrs. Coleman offered a dry, thin smile. "Some men never learn that an image without a foundation is just a ghost. As for Gabriela Rodriguez, the transition has been less dignified. She was spotted last week working a seasonal retail position at a mid-tier department store. Apparently, she tried to use her old black card to buy a lunch she couldn't afford, and when it was declined, she told the cashier that her sister was a billionaire who would have them fired." Maya looked down at her hands. She could almost smell the expensive, cloying perfume Gabriella used to wear, the scent of stolen luxury. Now, her sister was likely smelling of industrial floor cleaner and desperation. The new money, lifestyle Gabriella had flaunted, the Lexus bought with Maya's sweat, was gone, replaced by a bus pass and a mounting pile of credit card debt that not even Miguel Rodriguez could fix. Miguel had taken a job as a paralegal in a small firm, finally forced to use the degree he had treated as a decorative ornament for years. "And Sophia?" Maya asked, referring to her youngest cousin, who had stayed silent during the coup. "She's in school, Maya. The trust you set up for her education is secure. She's the only one who hasn't tried to call you for a bailout." Maya leaned back, the leather of her chair creaking softly. This was the victory she had planned. The perpetrators were humbled, the enablers were broke, and the wealth they had bled from her had been cauterized and reclaimed. But as she looked at the empty chair across from her, the wait-for-it moment she had anticipated for years felt different than she imagined. The karma was instant, proportional, and devastatingly public, yet the silence in the room felt heavy. She stood and walked to the window. Far below, she could see the tiny, ant-like movement of the city buses. Somewhere down there, Roberto was likely waiting at a stop, clutching a worn briefcase filled with delusions. He had lost the Lexus, the tailored suits, and the power to make her flinch. He was a small man in a very large world. "There is one more thing," Mrs. Coleman said, her voice dropping an octave. "The man from the bank, the one who approached you after the reveal, he's been asking for another meeting. He says the shell companies were just the tip of the iceberg." Maya touched the cool glass of the window. "Tell him I'm not interested. I've spent enough of my life looking through my father's trash. I have a company to run." As Mrs. Coleman exited, Maya picked up a small, framed photo on her desk. It was the only one she kept, a picture of her mother from years ago, before the greed of the Rodriguez men had turned their home into a battlefield. The glass was cracked at the corner. She had won. She was the most powerful woman in the sector, her stealth wealth now a shield rather than a disguise. But as she watched the sun set over the skyline, Maya realized the true cost of a boundless life. She had cut out the rot to save herself, but in doing so, she had become the last of her line. She was a queen in a kingdom of one, surrounded by the glittering, cold evidence of her own survival. The revenge was sweet, but the aftermath was a quiet, expensive solitude.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.